He mocked his ex-wife as a penniless burden and threw her out, but 7 years later, she walked into his gala with his twin heirs and bought his entire company. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. The sonogram image trembled in Joan Allen's hands as she stared at the two tiny flickers of life that would change everything. After 5 years of supporting Ryan Carlos through the grueling climb of his startup years, she was finally carrying the heirs to his growing empire. Her heart raced with a mixture of terror and pure joy as she imagined the look on his face. She had planned this reveal down to the last detail. The clinical silence of Ryan's glass-walled corner office was broken only by the hum of the city 80 floors below. Joan had brought a vintage bottle of champagne, the one they'd promised to open when he hit his first billion, and a handwritten card tucked into a small box. At 29, Joan still felt like the wide-eyed girl from the community library who had caught the eye of the tech world's rising star. When they'd met, she was a self-taught coder working as a receptionist to pay her rent. He was the charismatic visionary who promised they would build a legacy together. Their early years had been a whirlwind of shared dreams and late-night coffee in cramped offices, leading to a wedding that felt like a coronation. Tonight, she believed their shared journey would reach its most beautiful milestone. The sound of the heavy mahogany door clicking open made her pulse quicken. She quickly tucked the sonogram behind her back, wanting to savor the split second when his cold corporate mask would melt into the smile of a father. "Ryan, darling," she said, her voice vibrating with a secret happiness she couldn't wait to share, "I have the most incredible news to tell you." The heavy mahogany door didn't just open, it swung with a cold, calculated precision that sliced through the warm air of the office. Ryan didn't offer a smile or a greeting. He didn't even look at the vintage champagne waiting on his desk. He walked past Joan as if she were a piece of furniture he had grown tired of looking at, his silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the setting sun hitting the skyscrapers of the city he intended to own. "I don't have time for news, Joan," he said, his voice as clinical as a surgical blade. He sat behind his desk and slid a thick manila folder toward her. "Sign these. My lawyers have already authorized a generous severance. You'll have enough to find a comfortable apartment in the suburbs, somewhere away from the district." Joan felt the sonogram crinkle in her hand behind her back. That incredible news died in her throat, replaced by a sudden, sickening chill. "Severance? Ryan, what are you talking about? We're married. We're building a life." He finally looked up, his blue eyes devoid of the warmth she had spent 5 years trying to kindle. "We were building a foundation. But a man of my trajectory cannot afford to be weighed down by a homemaker who lacks the social grace to stand beside a world leader. You were a lovely companion during the startup phase, Joan, but let's be honest, you've reached your ceiling. I haven't even reached my floor." He stood up, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "You smell like flour and vanilla, Joan. I need a woman who smells like power and ambition. You're a relic of my past. I need a future that matches the height of this tower." The sonogram felt like it was burning her palm. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had coded for until her eyes bled, the man she had supported when he was nothing, and realized he didn't see a partner. He saw an obsolete asset. A surge of protective instinct, fiercer than anything she had ever felt, flared in her chest. If she told him now, if she revealed that she was carrying his heirs, he wouldn't welcome them with love. He would see them as a legacy assets. He would use his billions to take them from her, to raise them in this cold, glass cage, turning them into versions of himself. She realized in that moment that her silence was their only shield. I see, she whispered, her voice trembling but gaining a new, iron-like edge. She didn't sign the papers. She didn't take the $100 bill he mockingly tossed toward her as he signaled for security. 2 uniformed guards appeared at the door. "Show Ms. Allen out," Ryan commanded, already turning back to his monitor as if she had already ceased to exist. As she was led through the marble lobby of Carlos Tower, Joan didn't cry. She tucked the sonogram deep into her pocket and walked past the shimmering fountains and the elite staff who had bowed to her only yesterday. She stepped out into the rain, the glass shield of the tower reflecting a woman who was no longer a victim, but a mother with a secret. Ryan Carlos thought he had discarded a burden. He had no idea he had just declared war on the only person brilliant enough to take him. The transition from the luxury of the Carlos Tower to the damp, grey reality of a basement studio in the city's outskirts was a jagged pill that Joan swallowed every single day. The room smelled of old brick and industrial detergent, a far cry from the sandalwood and expensive glass she had known. In this cramped space, the only luxury was the quiet rhythm of 2 heartbeats. Luna and Nova lay tucked together in a single, chipped wooden crib, a thrift store find that Joan had sanded down until her fingers bled, making sure there wasn't a single splinter that could harm her daughters. They were her 2 small flames, the only warmth in a world that had turned freezing the moment she stepped out of that elevator. By day, Joan disappeared into the exhaustion of low-wage administrative work, her back aching from the lingering weight of a twin pregnancy that had tested the limits of her physical strength. But by night, when the rest of the city slept and the streetlights flickered outside her single, high-set window, Joan became someone else. She sat at a wobbly kitchen table, the blue light of a second-hand laptop illuminating the sharp lines of her face. The glow was her campfire, and the code was her weapon. Her fingers moved with a desperate, rhythmic speed, translating her frustration into complex algorithms. While the twins breathed in unison, Joan built the architecture of what would become Aegis Tech. She wasn't just writing software, she was weaving a digital fortress. Every line of code was a brick, every debugged script a victory against the man who had called her obsolete. There were nights when her vision blurred and her stomach growled with the hunger of a skipped meal, but one look at the crib silenced her weakness. She saw Ryan's eyes in Luna's gaze and his stubborn chin in Nova's pout, and it reminded her that she was hiding the most precious heirs in the world in a basement. She lived in a state of hypervigilance, an invisible woman in a crowded city. She used a maiden name for the utilities and paid for her groceries in cash, terrified that a digital footprint might lead Ryan's lawyers to her door. She knew how he operated. If he discovered they existed before she was powerful enough to protect them, he would treat her children like a hostile takeover. He would crush her to optimize his legacy. As the months bled into a year, the 2 small flames grew brighter. They began to crawl, then to babble, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls. To the world, Joan Allen was just another struggling single mother, a shadow in a cheap coat. But inside that basement, amidst the piles of technical manuals and the humming laptop, a titan was being born. Joan watched her daughter sleep and made a silent vow to the darkness. Ryan Carlos had thrown her into the dirt, forgetting that she was the daughter of a gardener. She knew exactly how to grow in the dark, and when she finally reached for the sun, she would take everything he thought was his. Down. The basement apartment had become a laboratory of desperation and genius. While Luna and Nova learned to take their first steps, holding onto the edge of the wobbly kitchen table, Joan was taking steps of her own into a digital frontier no one else dared to explore. She called it the Legis Protocol. It was a predictive AI designed to identify market vulnerabilities before they manifested, a tool that would have made Ryan Carlos the king of the world, but he had deemed the mind that created it obsolete. Joan quickly learned that the tech world was merely a digitized version of Ryan's glass office. She spent her lunch breaks in the back of a neighborhood library, pitching her software under the pseudonym to J.A. Sterling. The responses were a relentless barrage of condescension. Male venture capitalists, hiding behind Silicon Valley jargon, told her that her architecture was too emotional or lacked the aggressive edge required for the current market. One investor, during a brief video call where she had carefully curated a corner of the library to look like a professional office, told her she sounded like she had potential as a junior UI designer and asked if there was a man on the team who could explain the back-end logic. She closed the laptop, her knuckles white. The dismissal tasted like the flour and vanilla Ryan had mocked. But then, a soft thud followed by a wail came from the corner of the room. Nova had tumbled while trying to reach a colorful plastic block. Joan scooped her daughter up, pressing her face into the toddler's soft hair, while Luna crawled over to tug at her hem. The weight of their needs acted like a stabilizer for her rage. She didn't have the luxury of a bruised ego, she had two lives that depended on her turning no into yes. She went back to the keyboard with a cold, predatory focus. If the gatekeepers wouldn't let her in through the front door, she would simply rewrite the locks. She stopped seeking permission and started seeking results. She spent her final savings on a high-speed server lease, deploying a beta version of her protocol to trade micro-shares of failing tech stocks. It was a dangerous gamble, the digital equivalent of betting her children's milk money on a single card. The first night, she made $80. The second, $400. By the end of the month, the algorithm had turned her meager savings into a five-figure war chest. The algorithm of survival wasn't just code anymore, it was a living, breathing entity that grew smarter with every rejection she faced. Every time a male executive talked down to her, she tweaked the code to be more ruthless, more efficient, and more invisible. She was building a ghost in the machine, a silent titan that was beginning to eat the margins of the very men who had laughed at her. Joan looked at her daughters, now sleeping soundly after a meal of fresh organic fruit she could finally afford, and felt a jagged smile touch her lips. The world thought she was a victim of the glass ceiling, but Joan Allen was busy dismantling the floor beneath their feet. 7 years had passed since Joan Allen walked out of the Carlos Tower in the rain, and in that time, she had constructed a skyscraper of her own, not of glass and steel, but of data and unassailable influence. She was no longer the woman who smelled of flour and vanilla, she was the architect of Aegis Tech, a shadowy conglomerate that the financial world whispered about with equal parts awe and terror. Operating behind a network of offshore holdings and a carefully maintained veil of corporate anonymity, Joan had become the ghost of the exchange. From her high-tech command center, a minimalist sanctuary that overlooked the city from a discreet height, she moved billions with a keystroke, her predictive algorithms now the silent pulse of the global market. By her side were the two reasons the world was currently bowing to her code. Luna and Nova were no longer the infants who slept in a chipped wooden crib. At 7 years old, they were the crown jewels of Joan's secret empire. They were poised, brilliant, and possessed an intellectual sharpness that far exceeded their years. Luna sat at a sleek terminal, her eyes, so much like the man who had discarded them, scanning complex data streams with a cold, analytical precision. She didn't just understand the market, she felt its rhythms. Nova, on the other hand, was the master of strategy, her small fingers dancing over a tablet as she simulated hostile takeovers like other children played with dolls. The twins were fiercely loyal, a three-person phalanx that the world could not penetrate. They knew their mother's history not as a tragedy, but as a blueprint for survival. They understood that their existence was a secret that kept them safe, and they wore that secrecy like armor. When Joan looked at them, she didn't see the burdens Ryan had feared, she saw the future he was too short-sighted to imagine. They were refined, educated by the best private tutors money could buy in secret, and trained by Joan herself to see the world for what it was, a series of systems to be mastered. Joan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette sharp and commanding in a tailored suit that cost more than Ryan's generous severance offer. She watched the lights of the Carlos Tower in the distance. It looked smaller now, a relic of a man who thought he was a giant because he stood on a pedestal of sand. She had spent 7 years in the shadows, feeding her algorithm of survival until it became a leviathan. Her daughters were ready, her empire was solidified, and the trap was set. She wasn't just a mother anymore, and she wasn't just a CEO. She was the storm that Ryan Carlos had spent 7 years thinking he had outrun. As she felt Luna and Nova step up to stand on either side of her, Joan knew the time for hiding was over. The ghost was about to take on a physical form, and the haunting of Ryan Carlos was finally ready to begin. The invitation arrived not by a private courier, but via standard mail, stuffed into the rusted box of the modest apartment Joan still kept as her legal decoy. It was a heavy, cream-colored card embossed with gold leaf, the kind of ostentatious display Ryan Carlos favored when he was trying to hide a weakness. Behind the scenes, Joan knew the truth. Her algorithms had been quietly bleeding Ryan's venture capital firm for months. He was facing a liquidity crisis, a financial dip that his PR team was working overtime to spin. To bolster his image, he had orchestrated the Legacy Gala, a high-profile event to announce his engagement to the heiress of a banking dynasty, a merger designed to save his crumbling throne. Joan sat in her true home, a high-security penthouse of steel and silence, and opened the envelope with a letter opener made of polished obsidian. Beside the ornate invitation was a smaller, folded slip of paper. It was a check for $500, accompanied by a typed note on Ryan's personal stationery. "I know life hasn't been kind to those who lack the vision to keep up," it read. "Please use this travel stipend to find a decent dress and a bus ticket. It's important for my public image to show that I still care for the little people who were part of my early history. Don't be late." The malice was so transparent it was almost pathetic. He didn't just want her there, he wanted to use her as a prop, the poor, discarded ex-wife who would serve as a foil to his brilliant, wealthy new fiancé. He wanted to look at her from his stage and feel the surge of superiority that had always been his drug of choice. He assumed she was still the woman who smelled of flower, still living in the shadows of the ceiling he had set for her. Luna walked into the room, her eyes catching the gold glint of the card. "Is that him, Mother?" she asked, her voice calm and devoid of the childishness one might expect from a 7-year-old. "It is," Joan replied, sliding the $500 check across the table. "He thinks he is summoning a ghost to haunt his wedding feast. He wants to humiliate me in front of the world to prove he was right to leave me." Nova joined them, looking at the check with a scoff of pure disdain. "He's offering us a bus ticket while we own the digital infrastructure of his bank." Joan looked at her daughters, her 2 small flames now grown into twin pillars of fire. A cold, predatory light settled in her gaze. Ryan wanted a legacy? She would give him one. She would accept the invitation, but she wouldn't be arriving on a bus, and she wouldn't be wearing a decent dress bought with his charity. She would arrive as the storm he had spent 7 years ignoring, and she would bring the heirs he had traded for a title. "Luna, Nova," Joan said softly, the obsidian letter opener clicking against the table. "Find your best suits. It's time we showed your father exactly what the vision looks like." Joan did not go to a boutique. She summoned a fleet of world-class tailors to her private sanctuary, turning the penthouse into a war room of silk and strategy. This was not a makeover, it was the forging of an armor. Every stitch was calculated, every fabric choice a statement of intent. For herself, she chose a gown of midnight shimmering charcoal, a color that mimicked the cold, impenetrable depths of a deep-sea trench. It was a dress that didn't ask for attention, it commanded the light in the room to die at its feet. It was the silhouette of a woman who had transitioned from a pawn to the queen who held the board. But the true masterpiece of the evening was the transformation of Luna and Nova. Joan stood back, her eyes narrowing with clinical precision as the tailors fitted the girls into custom-tailored suits. They were not dressed as children, but as miniature titans. The fabric was a deep, royal navy, the exact shade of the Carlos family crest, and the cut of their blazers featured the sharp, peaked lapels that Ryan had made his personal trademark during his rise to power. Joan watched as the stylists pulled the girls' hair back into sleek, disciplined buns, revealing the striking symmetry of their faces. The effect was haunting. Without the distraction of childhood frills, the genetic legacy was undeniable. They possessed the same high, arrogant cheekbones as Ryan, the same piercing, obsidian-level gaze, and that slight, confident tilt of the chin that suggested they already owned the ground they stood on. They were the living, breathing proof of a bloodline Ryan thought he had successfully pruned. By dressing them in his likeness, Joan was preparing to hand him a mirror he couldn't look away from, a mirror that showed him the greatness he had discarded in favor of a hollow merger. While the girls practiced their poise, Joan focused on the final piece of her ensemble, her digital arsenal. She spent the final hour before their departure at her terminal, finalizing the Legis hostile takeover protocol. This was the real transformation. As she clicked the final confirmation, she wasn't just a scorned ex-wife seeking a moment of spotlight. She was the majority shareholder of a shadow firm that had spent the last 48 hours quietly acquiring the debt of Ryan's failing real estate partners. She checked her reflection one last time. The woman who once smelled of flower was gone, replaced by a vision of cold, calculated grace. She looked down at Luna and Nova, who stood perfectly still, their eyes reflecting the same iron resolve as her own. They were no longer secrets to be kept, they were the executioners of a legacy. Tonight, Joan whispered, her voice like velvet wrapped around a blade, we don't just attend a gala. We reclaim a name. Remember, when you see him, don't look for a father. Look for an opponent who has already lost. The girls nodded in unison, their movements perfectly synchronized. As they stepped into the private elevator that would take them to the armored limousine waiting below, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The transformation was complete. Joan Allen was no longer hiding in the shadows of the Carlos Tower. She was coming to tear it down, and she was bringing the heirs of his own blood to witness the demolition. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a synchronized thud that cut through the quartet's Vivaldi and the shallow hum of 1,000 high society conversations. For a moment, the air seemed to vanish from the room. Ryan Carlos stood at the center of a gilded circle, his arm draped possessively around his new fiancée, basking in the light of the photographer's flashes. He had been waiting for this, waiting for the moment his penniless ex-wife would stumble in, smelling of desperation and looking like a ghost of his past, to serve as the punchline to his triumph. But the woman who stepped across the threshold was no ghost. Joan Allen didn't just enter the room, she occupied it. Her charcoal gown moved like liquid smoke, catching the chandelier light in a way that made the diamonds of the socialites around her look like cheap glass. She carried herself with a terrifying, quiet gravity that pulled every eye toward her. The photographers, sensing a shift in the room's temperature, turned their lenses away from the stage and toward the entrance. The silence that followed was visceral. It wasn't the silence of confusion, but the silence of recognition. The elite of the tech and banking worlds, men who had ignored Joan's emails and laughed at her algorithm of survival, felt a cold sweat break across their brows. They recognized the silhouette. They recognized the cold, sharp gaze. This wasn't the relic Ryan had described, this was the ghost of the exchange, the billionaire CEO of Aegis Tech who had spent the last week systematically dismantling their market positions. Beside her, Luna and Nova walked with a poise that was almost supernatural for 7-year-olds. In their sharp navy suits, they looked like twin sculptures of the Carlos legacy, but refined, the arrogance of the father replaced by the lethal intelligence of the mother. As they moved through the crowd, the sea of silk and tuxedos parted. People didn't just move, they recoiled in a mixture of awe and fear. Ryan's glass of champagne tilted dangerously in his hand, his face draining of color until he looked like a statue of salt. He saw the woman he had tossed a $100 bill at, now standing before him as the most powerful person in the room. But more than that, he saw the girls. He saw his own eyes, his own jawline, and his own ruthless spirit looking back at him from two small, identical faces. That charity case he had invited to humiliate was gone. In her place stood the empress of his industry, and she had brought the heirs he never knew he had to witness his execution. Joan stopped exactly 10 feet from him, the distance a deliberate insult to his reach. She didn't say a word, but the slight, mocking curve of her lips spoke volumes. She had lived in his shadow for 5 years, but tonight, the shadow had grown large enough to swallow his entire world. The gala hadn't just been shattered, it had been reproposed. This was no longer Ryan's engagement party. It was Joan's coronation, and as the whispers began to rise like a tide, recognizing her name, her company, and her power, Ryan Carlos finally realized that the nobody he had discarded was the only person who truly knew how to destroy him. The room belonged to her, the market belonged to her, and for the first time in his life, Ryan was the one who was obsolete. The silence in the ballroom was brittle, a frozen lake waiting for the first crack. Ryan Carlos was the first to break it, though his voice lacked its usual predatory resonance. He let out a sharp, forced laugh that echoed hollowly against the gold-leafed ceiling. A grand entrance, Joan. Truly. I see you've spent your stipend on a theatrical troupe, he said, gesturing vaguely at the twins. He turned to his fiancée and the surrounding circle of billionaire investors, his face twisting into a mask of amused condescension. Don't be fooled by the costumes and the uncanny casting. This is a desperate publicity stunt by a woman who couldn't handle being left behind. She probably found these children in a catalogue to try and extort a second settlement. Joan didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the crowd. Her gaze remained fixed on Ryan, watching the beads of sweat form at his hairline. You always did underestimate the value of a solid backup, she said softly. With a subtle nod to Nova, the girl tapped a command into the tablet she carried. Instantly, the massive high-definition screen surrounding the ballroom, meant to show a montage of Ryan's legacy and his upcoming merger, flickered and died. A second later, they surged back to life, but the images were not of Ryan's yachts or skyscrapers. The screens displayed high-resolution scans of birth certificates, the names Luna Carlos and Nova Carlos typed in indelible ink. Beneath them, side by side with Ryan's own medical records from the Carlos Tower Executive Clinic, were certified DNA paternity results from 3 independent, world-renowned labs. The probability of paternity was displayed in a cold, digital red, 99.99%. The collective gasp of the board members sounded like a rushing wind. These were men and women who dealt in the hard currency of facts, and the facts currently looming over them were catastrophic. Ryan hadn't just discarded a burden, he had abandoned the legal heirs to the Carlos name, a violation of the very legacy he used to solicit their investments. You called them a stunt, Ryan, Joan said, her voice rising just enough to carry to the back of the hall. But they are the only real thing in this room. While you were busy building a throne of debt and shallow mergers, I was raising the future of your bloodline in the dark. You told me I had reached my ceiling. Tonight, I'm showing you that I own the sky. The board members began to pull away from Ryan as if he were radioactive. His fiancée's father, the patriarch of the banking dynasty Ryan so desperately needed, stepped forward, his face a mask of disgust. He didn't look at Ryan. He looked at the DNA results on the screen and then at the 2 girls who stood like silent executioners. You lied about your liabilities, Carlos, the older man hissed. You abandoned your own flesh and blood for the sake of an IPO. There will be no merger. There is no legacy for a man who treats his children like bad debt. Ryan reached out, his hand trembling, trying to grab the edge of the podium for support, but he found only empty air. The screen shifted again, now displaying the Aegis Tech logo, the firm that had been systematically shorting his stock all evening. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The woman he had mocked was not just the mother of his children, she was the predator who had already eaten his empire. Ryan looked at Luna and Nova, finally seeing not a stunt, but the terrifyingly brilliant reflections of his own ambition, honed and perfected by the woman he had called a nothing. The double reveal was complete. He had lost his company, his marriage, and his reputation in the span of 5 minutes, all while his daughters watched him crumble with the same cold detachment he had once shown their mother. The silence in the executive office of the Carlos Tower was no longer the clinical, powerful quiet of a man in control, it was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. Ryan Carlos sat in the same high-backed leather chair where he had once dismissed Joan as obsolete, but the mahogany desk before him was now bare, stripped of the awards and digital interfaces that had signaled his status. The glass walls that had once made him feel like the master of all he surveyed now only reflected a broken man with hollow eyes. The fallout from the gala had been a surgical strike from which there was no recovery. Within 48 hours of the double reveal, his stock had plummeted to near zero, his board of directors had formally ousted him for gross ethical misconduct and material deception, and the banking merger that was supposed to save him had vanished like smoke. Even the fiancée who was meant to be his future had left without a word, her father's lawyers ensuring Ryan would never step foot in their social circles again. He was bankrupt, not just financially, but socially and morally. He reached for his phone, but there were no messages, no panicked calls from subordinates, only a final notification from the building's new owners. The tower was being liquidated. Ironically, the buyer was a shell company he had only recently identified as a subsidiary of Aegis Tech. Miles away, atop a structure that pierced the clouds with more ambition than Ryan's tower could ever dream of, Joan Allen stood on a sprawling stone balcony. The wind whipped her dark hair, but she didn't move, she was the anchor of a new era. Beside her stood Luna and Nova, their silhouettes sharp against the sprawling tapestry of the city lights below. They didn't look like the burdens Ryan had feared, they looked like the architects of the century. The city didn't just lay before them, it responded to them. From this height Joan could see the digital pulse of the metropolis, a grid of light that was now managed and protected by the Aegis protocol. She had turned her algorithm of survival into a shield for the entire region, securing the very infrastructure Ryan had tried to exploit. "Is it ours now, Mother?" Nova asked, her voice calm, her eyes tracing the glowing veins of the streets below. "It was always ours," Joan replied, her voice steady and resonant. He thought a legacy was a name on a building. He thought power was something you took from others. He never understood that a real legacy is the strength you build when no one is watching. Luna looked toward the distant, darkened spire of the Carlos Tower. "He's still there, isn't he?" "In the dark." "He is exactly where he chose to be," Joan said, without a hint of malice, only the cold clarity of a woman who had moved beyond revenge into a state of total self-actualization. "He valued the glass more than the people inside it. Now, he has the glass, and nothing else." Joan placed her hands on her daughter's shoulders, feeling the strength in their small frames. She had started in a basement with a second-hand laptop and a heart full of hidden hope, and she had ended here, at the summit of the world. She had proven that flour and vanilla could be forged into steel, and that the woman Ryan Carlos had called nothing was actually everything. The broken woman who had walked out into the rain 7 years ago was gone, replaced by a titan who had built an empire on the foundation of maternal love and intellectual brilliance. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, Joan looked away from the past and toward the infinite potential of the morning. The city was waking up to a new leadership, one defined by integrity and the fierce, unyielding bond of the three of them. Ryan Carlos was a footnote in a story he thought he owned, while Joan, Luna, and Nova were the authors of a future that had only just begun. They stood together, the creator and her masterpieces, watching the light return to a world they had finally made their own.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.